Wait, are you really putting that inside me right now? Lena Hart's voice fractured on the last word, sharp with terror, the sound skittering. Across the empty New Mexico, flats like something wounded and desperate, trying to escape the open land. Caleb Dunn didn't look up when she said it. He couldn't. He had already rolled the cloth into a tight, compact plug, his fingers moving with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing there is no other choice left. And he was packing it deep into the gushing, wound to pinch the bleeding shut, before it carried her away. It wasn't dirty, not the way it sounded when spoken aloud, not the way it would look to anyone who didn't understand what blood loss could do in minutes out here. It was the only thing that might keep her alive. Blood was running too fast down her leg, darker than it should have been, slick and shining against the pale dust, pooling where the ground dipped slightly, as if the earth itself was trying to collect what she couldn't afford to lose. If Caleb waited for permission, she was done. If he stopped to explain, she would bleed out before the sun shifted an inch in the sky. No time left, he muttered, more to himself than to her, because talking didn't slow blood and sympathy didn't seal wounds. His hands kept moving. They had to. Lena tried to pull back, fingers clawing uselessly at the dirt, nails breaking, breath coming apart in short, broken pulls that sounded like sobs she refused to finish. From the outside, Caleb knew exactly how it looked, and the knowledge burned worse than the sun on his neck. An old rancher down on his knees, a young woman flat on her back, torn cloth, blood everywhere, no witnesses in 100 directions. That picture alone could get a man buried. Without a question, asked if the wrong eyes happened to see it. Caleb tore another strip from his coat, the fabric ripping loud in the quiet, rolled it tight and forced it into place, packing the wound hard enough to make his jaw lock. Lena screamed once, raw and honest, the kind of sound people don't fake and don't forget. Then, cutting through that sound, came something worse. Hooves, distant but real, a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind or the land. Before the next beat hit the dirt, there was one thing that had to be said plain, even if nobody but the open sky heard it. This story comes from old frontier accounts, from things written down by men who survived long enough to admit what they'd seen, and from tales told by folks who lived with the weight of those days until the end of their lives. If this kind of story isn't for you, you're allowed to rest easy tonight. Turn back now and keep your peace. But if you stay, understand this much from the start. The real danger wasn't what Caleb was doing to save her life. The real danger was who was riding toward them, and what those men might decide this scene meant, before either of them could speak a word in their own defense. 2 days earlier, none of this had looked like trouble yet. It had looked small. The kind of small mistake people make before they learn how the frontier actually works, and how little forgiveness it carries for innocence. Red Hollow was loud that morning, all dust and hammer noise, with men pretending the railroad hadn't already changed the rules for everyone, who thought land stayed, loyal just because you loved it. Caleb rode in the way he always did, slow and careful, hides bundled behind his saddle, planning to trade and buy salt and be gone before the sun climbed too high. Towns were useful, but they were never safe. Lena rode in alone not long after, carrying a narrow wooden case clutched tight against her side like it mattered more than money or comfort. Her name was Lena Hart, 24 years old, still young enough to believe that a town full of people offered more protection than open country ever could. She said the papers inside that case were her father's deeds, water rights, lines drawn on paper that decided who lived easy and who went dry. Things meant for a lawyer in the next town over. She didn't say much else, and Caleb didn't ask. Out here, asking too many questions made people curious in the wrong ways, and curiosity could get you followed. That was when Caleb noticed Grant Mallory, clean boots in a dusty town, a soft voice that never rose, eyes that didn't blink when they settled on Lena's case. Mallory talked about progress the way a preacher talked about salvation, promising railroads and opportunity, and better futures for folks who signed where he pointed. What he didn't say, what he never said, was how many ranchers woke up one morning without water, without land, without even a place left to bury. They're dead because ink had decided they no longer belonged. Later that day, in a saloon thick with smoke and bad patience, one of Mallory's men bumped Lena hard enough to test whether she'd fall. It wasn't an accident. It was a question asked with a shoulder instead of words. Caleb stepped in before she hit the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't throw a punch until there was no other way to stop the man's hand from grabbing what didn't belong to him. The room went quiet the way it always does when men decide what kind of trouble they're willing to die for. When Caleb and Lena left, boots scraping against warped boards, Caleb felt something settle heavy in his gut. Grant Mallory wasn't finished. Men like him never were. And by sunrise the next morning, Caleb and Lena were already riding out, not knowing that the worst decision had already been made. For them by someone who wouldn't be there to answer for it. They left Red Hollow before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Not running, just early enough to avoid being noticed by anyone who might decide to remember their faces. Caleb kept them off the main road, cutting across hard ground where wagon wheels hated to go in tracks. Didn't last long enough to tell stories. By midday, the land started talking in a language Caleb knew too well. A ribbon of dust on the horizon that stayed too steady to be the wind, too purposeful to be coincidence. That was when he understood what Mallory really wanted. Not just the papers, not just the land those papers represented. Mallory wanted a story. Something simple enough that people wouldn't ask questions once a rope came out. An old rancher and a young woman riding alone into nowhere. A picture easy to explain, easier to condemn. Caleb promised himself then that he would never let it happen again. Even though he already knew promises made to the open land rarely survived contact with it. Lena finally asked why they couldn't just turn back. Why a town full of people felt more dangerous than the empty country stretching out ahead of them. Caleb told her the part that mattered. The part nobody liked hearing until it was too late. Crowds don't need facts. They need permission. And once permission is given, the truth doesn't stand much of a chance. If you're still here listening to this, there's one small thing to ask before the road narrows. If these old roads and hard choices speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest of what's coming. Pour yourself a cup of tea, settle in where you are, and tell us what time it is and where you're listening from. Because once they crossed the next stretch of broken ground, the choice was gone. Ahead lay a narrow path Caleb didn't trust. Behind them, the dust was getting closer. And right then, the horse did the one thing Caleb hadn't planned for. The next sound he heard wasn't thunder. It was wire singing tight, a thin metallic note that cut straight through him. The horse felt it before Caleb saw it, ears snapping back, body tensing like a rope pulled too hard. Caleb reached for the reins, already knowing he was a second too late. The horse lunged and caught a low strand of fresh, barbed wire stretched careless and mean. Across an old trail, someone's claim staked without thought for who might come through afterward. Barbed wire, the kind men used to say land was theirs and forget that others still had to pass. The horse went down hard, a violent tumble that threw dust and breath and time into chaos. When it cleared, Lena was on the ground trying to stand on a leg that wouldn't answer her, confusion giving way to fear in her eyes. Then Caleb saw the blood. Too much, too fast. He dragged her behind a dead juniper, low and twisted, the only cover they had, and pressed his hand down until it was slick and useless. That was when the truth settled in cold and final. This wasn't a wait-and-see wound. He tore open his saddlebag and found nothing but sweat, dust, and bad luck. No bandage, no kit. That was when Lena really looked at him, and the fear in her eyes changed shape. "Wait, you're packing it into the cut," she said, and the words shook apart. Caleb didn't argue. He didn't explain. "No time left," he said, holding pressure until the bleeding slowed enough to give her a chance. She screamed, not because of him, but because pain and knowing had finally met. Caleb tied the wrap tight, hands steady, because they had to be, and then he heard it again. Hooves. Close now. 3 riders cresting the ridge, slow and easy, like men who already owned the ending. One of them wore a badge that caught the sun just right. From where they sat, all they could see was blood, torn cloth, and an old man on his knees. And in that moment, Caleb knew the fight ahead wouldn't be about what he'd done. It would be about what they chose to believe. And the man with the badge smiled like he'd been waiting for this picture all day. Part 2. They rode back to Red Hollow the way men escort trouble they already feel finished with. Slow enough to savor it, close enough that no one could mistake who held the reins. Lena was tied into the saddle with a carefulness that felt false, the kind meant to keep her alive just long, enough to answer questions, Nobody planned to hear the answers to. Caleb walked beside the horse because they didn't trust him mounted. Because an old rancher on foot with blood on his hands fit the picture better. Every step back toward town felt heavier than the last, dust clinging to sweat, eyes burning from sun and shame that hadn't been earned but was already being claimed. The badge caught light again and again as the lawman shifted in his saddle, like a signal to anyone watching from a distance that the story had found its shape. By the time Red Hollow came into view, Lena's breath had steadied into something thin and painful, her jaw set hard enough to crack. Caleb watched her out of the corner of his eye and wondered if she knew what kind of strength it took to stay awake, when your body wanted to fold itself shut and disappear. He knew because he'd seen it before, back when men still pretended mercy was a choice and not a luxury. They brought them in through the main stretch because side streets didn't serve the purpose. People came out of doorways and windows and leaned forward on railings, curiosity already sharpening into something else. Nobody asked what happened on the trail. Nobody asked why a young woman was alive when the blood said she shouldn't be. They saw what they were shown, and what they were shown was enough. The sheriff, a broad man with a voice trained to sound like patience, took one look at Caleb and nodded like a decision had been waiting for him all morning. The badge man dismounted with a show of care, adjusting his belt, eyes never leaving Lena's torn clothes. He asked her name like it was a courtesy and not a test. She gave it anyway. Lena Hart, she said, and her voice held. Papers, the sheriff said, and Caleb felt the world narrow because he knew what came next. They took the case from her before she could reach for it, fingers prying it loose, wood scraping against wood as it was set aside like evidence already understood. They took Caleb to a cell that smelled of old iron and older fear, the door closing with a sound too final for justice. From the other side, he could hear the town breathing, a low murmur that rose and fell as men decided what kind of afternoon this would be. He sat on the bench and listened to hammer strikes begin somewhere outside, steady and deliberate, the kind of work done by men who wanted to be sure of the outcome. Each strike landed with a weight that settled into his bones. He closed his eyes and thought about the barbed wire singing tight, about how land changed hands now without bullets, about how easy it was to turn help into a hanging if the story wanted it. Lena was taken to a back room where a doctor came only after being asked twice, and even then with a look that said he knew which way the wind was blowing. He examined the wound with hands that trembled just enough to show he understood the risk of caring too well. He didn't remove the packing. He didn't ask how it got there. He wrapped it clean and nodded once, small and private, to Lena, like that was all the decency he could afford. Outside, Grant Mallory arrived like a man called by a bell only he could hear. Boots still clean, smile still soft. He spoke to the sheriff quietly, words falling into place without effort. Progress, he said again. Order, he said. The law, he said. And each word landed easy because it had landed before. Someone mentioned Caleb's age. The difference between him and Lena. The fact that they'd ridden out alone. It didn't matter who said it. Once it was said, it belonged to everyone. Caleb listened from his cell and knew the shape of it now. How the afternoon would stretch into evening with purpose. He thought about his ranch, about the land he'd worked without ever owning the kind of paper Mallory wanted so badly. He thought about the way Lena had looked at him when he said no time left, about trust built in the space of a breath. A tired clerk sat at his desk with the case open in front of him, the deeds inside smelling faintly of old ink and sweat. He read them once, then again, slower the second time, his brow furrowing as something didn't line up with the easy ending everyone expected. Water rights that predated the railroad filings, names that didn't belong to anyone in Red Hollow. He swallowed and looked at the door, like it might accuse him of something just for noticing. Outside, the frame went up, rope tested by hands that pretended it was routine. Children were sent home, wives told to stay inside if they didn't want to see, and men gathered anyway because telling them not to only made it more important. Lena asked to see Caleb and was told later. She asked again and was told to rest. She lay there staring at the ceiling, counting breaths, listening to the town decide whether she was a victim or a witness or something worse. When evening came on, the heat broke just enough to make the air feel heavy instead of cruel. A lawman from outside town rode In then, dust-streaked and tired, the kind of man who didn't belong to anyone here. He asked questions because that was his job, and because he didn't owe favors that needed protecting. The clerk found his courage in that moment, thin and shaking, but real, and handed over the papers with a look that said he'd be thinking about this for the rest of his life. The lawman read and went still. He asked for Lena. He asked for Caleb. The sheriff bristled. Mallory smiled thinner, and the crowd shifted like something waking up. Caleb was brought out, wrists bound, eyes adjusting to light and faces that had already judged him. He stood straight because he didn't know any other way. Lena was helped forward, pale but standing. And when she spoke, her voice shook but didn't break. She told it plain. About the wire, about the fall, about the blood, about hands that did what had to be done when there was no time left. She didn't dress it up. She didn't beg. She spoke while afraid because the truth didn't care how she felt. The lawman held up the papers and read from them, slow and clear. Names and dates cutting through the noise. The rope stayed hanging. The hammering stopped. Silence spread in a way that made men uncomfortable because it asked them to sit with what they'd almost done. Grant Mallory stepped back like he'd just remembered another appointment. The sheriff cleared his throat. Caleb felt the weight lift in pieces, not all at once, because some things never do. They were released without ceremony, because ceremony would have meant admitting error. Red Hollow went back to its business with the relief of people who'd avoided a reckoning by the skin of their teeth. Outside town, under a sky finally cooling, Lena sat and let the shaking come now that she was allowed. Caleb stood nearby and watched the road, knowing how close they'd come to being another story told wrong. Justice hadn't arrived clean or proud. It had limped in late, held together by a scrap of paper and a few people who decided decency was worth the risk. Caleb didn't feel like a hero. Lena didn't feel like a survivor yet. They felt tired and older and aware of how thin the line really was. And as the sun slipped low and shadows stretched long, both of them understood the lesson the land had been teaching all along, that doing the right thing often looks wrong from a distance. That truth is fragile when men are in a hurry, and that sometimes it costs you your name before it saves your soul. They didn't stay in Red Hollow after that, not even long enough for the dust to settle back into its old habits. Towns remembered too well when they were embarrassed, and Red Hollow had nearly lynched an innocent man because it was convenient. That kind of place never forgot the people who reminded it of its own reflection. By the next morning, Caleb had a fresh horse saddled, slower than the one they'd lost, but steady, and Lena sat wrapped in clean cloth and borrowed strength. Her leg, bound tight and aching with every heartbeat. The doctor had warned her not to ride, which meant nothing out here. Not riding wasn't an option the frontier recognized. Caleb didn't argue with her when she insisted. He just adjusted the stirrup so she wouldn't have to lift too high and told her when to lean. They left without anyone waving, without any goodbyes that might turn into questions. The road out of town felt longer than the one in, heavy with things left unsaid. Lena watched the buildings fall behind them, her jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. Like if she didn't look back, the place might lose the power it had tried to claim over her. Caleb rode quiet beside her, every sense stretched thin, listening for hooves that might follow, knowing better than to trust the absence of sound. The land opened again, wide and honest in its indifference. And for the first time since the wire sang tight, Lena let herself breathe a little deeper. Pain flared when the horse stepped wrong, white and sharp, but she didn't make a sound. She had learned already that silence could be a kind of armor. They made camp early that night, tucked against a low rise that broke the wind. Fire kept small and careful. Caleb handed her water and waited until her hands stopped shaking, enough to drink without spilling. She thanked him then, quietly, like the word was too fragile to speak loud. He nodded and stared into the flames, because meeting her eyes felt heavier than facing a rope. Later, when the stars came out clean and bright, Lena asked the question that had been circling her since Red Hollow let them go. "Why did you help me?" she said, not accusatory, not soft, just honest. Caleb took his time answering, because answers mattered when you chose to give them. He told her about the first time he'd seen a man bleed out for lack of someone willing to do what looked wrong. He told her about a boy he'd buried without a name because nobody had stayed long enough to learn it. He told her that some lines didn't belong to towns or railroads or badges, and when you crossed them, you didn't come back the same. Lena listened and nodded like she understood more than he'd said. Sleep came in pieces, broken by pain and memory, but morning still found them alive, which felt like a victory they didn't talk about. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm, riding when the light was kind, resting when it wasn't, avoiding roads that felt watched. Lena's strength returned slow and uneven, her temper quicker than before, her eyes sharper. She asked questions now, about land and water and how men like Mallory kept winning even when they were wrong. Caleb answered what he could and admitted when he didn't know, which earned him more trust than pretending ever would have. They talked about where she might go, the lawyer her father had trusted, the town that still might be safe if she arrived, without a story already chasing her. Somewhere along the way, the fear shifted into something else, a hard resolve that sat steady in her chest. She practiced walking without the horse when they stopped, gritting her teeth through the pain because she refused to let it decide her limits. Caleb watched and said nothing, knowing better than to interfere with someone building themselves back together. One afternoon, they spotted riders far off, dust rising in a way that set Caleb's shoulders tight. He guided them into a shallow cut and waited, hand resting near his gun without touching it. The riders passed without turning, silhouettes against the sun, and only then did he let the breath out of his chest. Lena saw it and understood what safety really meant out here. Not the absence of danger, but the constant awareness of it. By the time they reached the edge of the next county, the land had changed. Greener in places, softer in others, and Lena smiled for the first time without forcing it. They stopped near a creek and washed the dust from their hands, the water cold and clean, carrying away a little of what Red Hollow had left on them. That night, Lena spoke again, this time about what she'd do with the land if she managed to keep it, how water should belong to people who needed it, not men who collected signatures. Caleb listened and felt something like hope stir, cautious and quiet. He didn't say it, but he thought her father would have been proud. When they finally parted ways 2 mornings later, it wasn't dramatic. They stood facing each other under a pale sky, the kind that promised heat later, and shared a look that held everything they didn't need to say. Lena reached out and squeezed his hand, her grip firm despite the lingering weakness, and told him she'd remember what he'd done. Caleb told her to live long enough to make it matter. She rode off toward her future. Back straight, eyes forward, and Caleb watched until she was a small shape against the land. He turned his horse the other way then, back toward a life that would never quite be the same. Red Hollow faded into something like a bad dream he couldn't fully shake. But the lesson stayed sharp. Truth didn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrived when someone chose it, even knowing the cost. Caleb rode on carrying that weight, knowing there would be other roads, other moments when the right thing would look wrong again, and hoping he'd be steady enough to choose it every time. The land didn't change all at once after Lena rode away, but Caleb did. He felt it in the way the saddle sat heavier, in how his eyes stayed longer on every rise and cut, in the way silence no longer felt empty but full of things that could go wrong if he stopped paying attention. He rode west for a time, then south, taking work where it came and leaving before roots could tangle around his boots. Men still talked about Red Hollow and nearby towns. The story already bent into shapes that made people comfortable. Some said the old rancher had been lucky. Some said the girl had lied, pretty enough to fool a judge. Very few said the truth out loud, because truth had a way of demanding things afterward. Caleb didn't correct them. He learned that lessons only land when someone is ready to carry them, and most folks weren't. Weeks later, he passed the stretch of trail where the wire had sung tight, the barbed strand still there, rust starting to claim it like guilt settling in. He stopped and cut it down, not because it fixed anything, but because leaving it felt like agreeing with what it had done. He thought of Lena then, of her voice holding steady when it mattered, of how courage didn't arrive loud but stayed when it was needed. Somewhere east, she would be speaking to men who liked ink more than blood, pressing her father's name into rooms that decided futures. He hoped she'd found allies. He hoped the land would answer her better than it had answered him. One evening, as the sun bled out across the flats in colors too deep to name, Caleb made camp alone and listened to the quiet settle around him. He understood now that the frontier didn't care about intentions, only actions, and that mercy often wore the face of something easily misunderstood. The memory of the cell, the hammering, the rope waiting without patience, stayed with him not as fear but as a reminder carved deep. He had done what had to be done, and the cost had been real. Names were fragile things. So were lives. Sometimes you saved one and nearly lost the other. He lay back and watched the stars come out. The same stars that had watched worse men make easier choices and live with them. Sleep came slow but honest. At dawn, he saddled up and rode on, carrying with him a truth the land had taught in blood and dust. That doing the right thing doesn't promise safety, only meaning, and that meaning is enough if you're willing to pay for it. Somewhere far behind him, Red Hollow would keep pretending it had learned something. Somewhere ahead, new roads waited. Indifferent and exacting, ready to ask again who he was when no one else was watching. And if the moment came, Caleb knew the answer he'd give, even if it cost him everything a second time.